Welcome, Maja Langvad from Denmark. Welcome, Maja.
Thank you.
We also met at Ledbury Poetry Festival 2019. These were brighter times than now. Maja Langvad is a writer, translator, and editor who lives in Copenhagen. She has been an influential voice in debates on transnational adoption and is the author of several books, including She is Angry, an insistent long poem. Her books explore themes such as transnational adoption, national identity, racism, kinship, illness, and the act of writing.
So first I will read a text in Danish. It's a text from my book called Feinhugger Dane Appendix, and it's 20 questions for my biological mother. Spørgsmål til min biologiske mor. 1. Vil du ønske, at jeg ikke havde opsøgt dig? 2. I det tilfælde, at jeg flytter tilbage til Danmark. A. Vil du blive skuffet? B. Vil du blive lettet? 3. Er du skuffet over, at jeg blev adopteret til Danmark og ikke til USA, som du altid har troet? 4. I det tilfælde, at du ikke havde bortadopteret mig, hvilke konsekvenser forestiller du dig da, at det ville have fået for mine søstre, min far og dig? 5. Elsker du min biologiske far? 6. Vil du ønske, du havde bortadopteret en af mine søstre i stedet for mig? Og hvis ja, hvem? 7. Hvis et forældrepar ikke har nogen sønner, er det ifølge traditionel koreansk tankegang kvindens skyld. Synes du, at skylden er berettiget? 8. Ser du ned på andre kvinder, der har bortadopteret et barn? Og hvis ja, synes du, at folk har ret til at se ned på dig? 9. Hvis du ikke havde været fattig, dengang du bortadopterede mig, vil du da have beholdt mig, selvom jeg ikke var en dreng? 10. Har du fortalt mig sandheden om, hvorfor du bortadopterede mig? 11. I det tilfælde, at du havde beholdt mig, ville der da have været råd til, at jeg fik en uddannelse? 12. Hvilke værdier lægger du størst vægt på? A. Materielle. B. Kulturelle. C. Menneskelige. D. Åndelige. E. Andre. 13. Ser du gerne, at jeg hjælper dig økonomisk? Og hvis ja, hvilket beløb vil efter din mening være passende? 14. Hvordan forestiller du dig vores relation i fremtiden? 15. I det tilfælde, at jeg fortalte dig, at jeg er lesbisk, vil du da ikke længere se mig? 16. Tror du nogensinde, at du røber for dine kollegaer, at du har bortadopteret et barn? 17. Hvis jeg tilfældigvis møder dig sammen med en kollega. A. Vil du fortælle din kollega, hvem jeg er? B. Vil du lyve om, hvem jeg er? C. Vil du lade som om, at du ikke kender mig? 18. Er der ting, du ikke fortæller mig, fordi der altid er en tolk til stede, når vi kommunikerer? Og hvis ja, hvilke ting? 19. Forventer du, at jeg lærer koreansk? 20. I det tilfælde, at jeg prioriterer andre ting frem for at lære koreansk, skrive, rejse med mere, vil du da kunne forstå min prioritering? And now I will read or two excerpts actually from my book called She's Angry, A Testimony on Transnational Adoption. The excerpts have been translated by Katrine Øgaard Jensen. She's angry about being an import. She's angry about being an export. She's angry that adoption agencies in both sending and receiving countries make money off transnational adoption. She's angry to read in Outsiders Within writing on transnational adoption that South Korea brings in more than $15 million annually through the mediation of transnational adoption. She's angry that adoption agencies proactively seek children who can be giving up for adoption. They should, of course, help children out of unsafe environments, but to be on the actual lookout for children who could be giving up for adoption is taking it too far, she thinks. In her opinion, there should be a bigger focus on directly helping the parents of vulnerable children to avoid separating those children from their parents and their original culture. She's angry to hear a rumor that the American adoption agency, Hold International Children's Services, is looking for new markets, including North Korea, in which they could find children who might be giving up for adoption. Hold International Children's Services already mediates adoptions from Bulgaria, China, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Haiti, India, South Korea, the Philippines, Romania, Thailand, Uganda, Ukraine, the US, and Vietnam. If the regime in North Korea were to collapse, North Korea could also be added to the list. It's probably safe to assume that the agency would like to see the North Korean regime collapse so they could gain access to a great new market. She's angry that adoption these days seems more like a matter of finding children for parents rather than finding parents for children. That's how a phenomenon such as child harvesting emerged. Adoption agencies wouldn't need employees to convince vulnerable parents into giving their child up for adoption if the demand for children didn't exceed the supply. She's angry that the demand for children exceeds the supply. She's angry with the interpreter for not communicating what her biological family is discussing. She has to pretend to be worried about one of her biological parents being sick in order to get Kyung-hee to tell her what they're discussing. She's angry to discover that her biological family is talking about a vacation they're planning, a vacation that cannot include her because her older sisters haven't told their husbands about her. She's angry with her older sisters for not telling their husbands about her. She can't help but take it personally, even though she knows they're not ashamed of her, but of their parents who gave her up for adoption. She's angry with her sisters because they've decided to never tell their husbands about her. She's angry with her biological parents for accepting her sister's decision. She's angry with her biological mother for telling her to put her sister's needs above her own, that she's just one against her sisters and they are four. She's angry with herself for not putting her biological family's needs above her own. She's angry with her biological family for not putting her needs above theirs. She's angry with herself for not making it a demand. Rather than letting her sisters decide whether or not to tell their husbands, she should have demanded that her sisters tell their husbands about her. It would have been in accordance with Korean culture, she thinks, if she had phrased it as a demand. She's angry at Korean culture. She's angry at American culture. She's angry that most of the world has been Americanized. She's angry that South Korea has been Americanized. She has a hard time imagining a country that the US has affected more than South Korea. She's angry at the United States of America. She's angry with her biological father for praising the US. She's aware that he belongs to a different generation, a generation that sees American soldiers who served in the Korean War as heroes. Still, she cringes whenever he applauds the country. It's the same with Korean adoptees in the US, Andrew says, when she tells him that her father says things like USA number one. Those who belong to the older generation of Korean adoptees in the US are grateful to have been adopted, whereas he, part of the younger generation of adoptees, thinks of transnational adoption as American imperialism. She's angry about American imperialism. She's angry about imperialism. She's angry about Eurocentrism. She's angry about colonialism. She's angry about transnational adoption being a modern form of colonialism. She's angry with herself for considering transnational adoption to be a modern form of colonialism. Just because white Westerners adopt children of non-white parents in a vast majority of cases, that doesn't automatically make transnational adoption a modern form of colonialism. She's angry with herself for not considering transnational adoption to be a modern form of colonialism. Like it or not, transnational adoption rests on a colonial past. People's reasons for adopting are rooted in the same beliefs that led Europeans to colonize large part of the world in the 16th century. Back then, Europeans thought they knew what was best for the native population. Today, Europeans think they know what is best for children born in non-Western countries. She's angry with those who think they know what's best for children born in non-Western countries. She's angry with her adoptive mother for assuming she knew what was best for her. How could she not see her adoptive mother as a colonizer? She no longer feels comfortable following her adoptive mother around in Denmark. Walking next to her adoptive mother only emphasizes the fact that she has been colonized. When they walk together on the street, it's apparent to everyone that she was adopted by her mother. The balance of power is unmistakable. She's angry with herself for thinking of her adoptive mother as a colonizer. She's angry with herself for thinking that she's been colonized. She's angry that she's been colonized. It may be true that she grew up with better educational opportunities in Denmark than she would have had in South Korea, but at least she wouldn't have been colonized. This is not to say that she would rather have grown up in South Korea. It is, generally speaking, a waste of time to walk around regretting not having grown up in another country. But being a Korean adoptee does come at a high price. In his discussion paper, What is Danish Racism?, Kim Sue Rasmussen, a scholar of philosophy and cultural studies, writes, the psychological and existential effect is that the colonized individual will eventually consider themselves as an other. This experiencing of oneself as an other, where the colonized individual both views themselves and experiences themselves the same way the colonial power perceives the colonized individual, is what Fanon describes as cultural alienation. Kim Sue Rasmussen continues, the colonized person is, according to Fanon, confronted with a choice between identifying completely with the colonial power and rejecting it altogether in an attempt to complete an extensive process best conveyed by the expression to go native. In all honesty, she wonders whether it's even possible for her to, in Fanon's words, go native. Whether it's possible for her to become Korean, whatever that means. Maybe it's not meant to be taken that literally, Andrew says, when she tells him about the concept of going native. Maybe just moving to South Korea is enough, he says. She's angry at anyone who thinks she moved to South Korea because she wasn't comfortable enough in Denmark. Her moving to South Korea is about understanding her own history and, by extension, South Korea's history, about having any access at all to a history that is hers. She's angry with herself for assuming that Korean adoptees moved to South Korea because they weren't comfortable enough in their adoptive countries. Korean adoptees remigrate for many reasons, adoption researcher Lene Myung explained to her over a Skype call, and those reasons don't necessarily have anything to do with their sense of belonging in their adoptive countries. She says that some Korean adoptees who grew up in the US and who are fluent in English have more job opportunities in South Korea than in the States. She finds it interesting how remigration breaks with the idea that transnational adoption is a movement from one country to another, from the sending country to the receiving country. When Korean adoptees choose to move to South Korea, it paves the way for transnational adoption to be understood as a migration that isn't necessarily completed when someone arrives at the adoptive country. She's angry that she doesn't feel comfortable in her adoptive country. She's angry that she doesn't feel comfortable in her country of origin. Although, to be fair, in some ways she does feel more comfortable in South Korea, and in other ways she feels more comfortable in Denmark. For instance, she feels more at home in the South Korean landscape than in the Danish. Somehow, the mountains seem better suited for her temperament than the flat Danish countryside. In South Korea, she has a feeling of disappearing into the landscape, something she hadn't felt since that time in Greenland, of disappearing into something greater than herself. Thank you.
Being touched by. Being touched by.
Thank you, Maja Lee Langvad, for your poetry. I want to ask you two questions. Why did you write this book?
Well, writing the book was for me part of my process of becoming critical of transnational adoption. So from 2007 to 2010, I was part of this adoptee community in Seoul in South Korea. It's a community that consists of activists and artists and academics who are critical of transnational adoption and who challenge the idea of transnational adoption as a win-win situation. So here in the West, there is this common, or the dominating view in the West is that transnational adoption is always a good thing. It's always in the best interest of the child, of the biological parents and the adoptive parents. It's almost like viewed as a humanitarian act, so that you save a child from like poverty or a miserable life when you adopt. But in Korea, people in the community, they would advocate for alternatives to South Korea's adoption program. So for example, like in Korea, it's mostly unwed mothers who feel forced to give their child up for adoption. But people in the community would try to support unwed mothers so they are capable of keeping their child if they want to. And when I lived in Korea, I got very involved in adoption, and I read a lot of books and articles about adoption, and I met a lot of other adoptees from all over the world because it's a very international community. So all the reading and the conversations with other adoptees led to the book. And well, it took me 7 years to write the book. So it was a very long process. Yeah.
And the next question is, all the passages in the book begin with, "She is angry." Could you talk about the anger in the book?
Yeah, I can talk a bit about the anger since it's like the driving force in the book. There's this general opinion that anger is a destructive emotion, that it's an emotion that needs to be controlled. And if you can't control it, you have a mental problem. And in terms of transnational adoption, it's often a taboo feeling. There's this demand that you have to be grateful as an adoptee, that adoptees have been saved from a miserable life or poverty by the adoptive parents, so you have to be grateful. But I wanted actually to insist on the anger. And for me, writing was a way, I think, also to come to terms with my anger. But at the same time, I guess it produced more anger to write about it. And the more I got to know about transnational adoption, the more angry I got, of course, because I found out many new things. I think there are different kinds of anger being expressed in the book. That both this kind of anger that is actually grief. It's grief being expressed through anger, grief of having been separated from one's birth family, but also ideological grief of losing one's faith in transnational adoption. And I think then there's also the kind of anger that one could also call indignation, so that you are indignant at an injustice being done to someone. And then finally, there's this small, I think, idiosyncratic anger, which is also the comic element in the book, because she's also angry that the airplane was invented, for example. So, yeah, I think anger is really it's often in our society a taboo feeling, but it's also a feeling that calls for change. So in that way, it can be a very productive feeling, and it can lead to changes and to revolutions.
Thank you, Maja. I'm lucky having met you in Ledbury.
Yes, it was very nice meeting you there.
I was very drawn to this She's Angry. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. It was a pleasure to read and talk to you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.